So I'd like to turn and open this to the public comment and questions over the web. I do have one that came in. So why don't I start there? And this is a two-part question, and it's from Bob Zach from Pacific Fishing Magazine. Oh, and let's see. We'll continue this. So so the question is it's for David, and the question is, what happens if a village refuses to cooperate with a survey once or repeatedly? How do you estimate their subsistence harvesting volume?
That's a very good question. Like I mentioned, there was one community. Actually, there were two communities that declined to participate. Equock declined, as well as Manicodic. In the case of Manicodic, in the case of both communities, we went back 2 times. We tried a couple of times the first year, and then the following year, as the project continued into a second year, we went back and asked them again. We gave them another presentation. In the case of Manicodic, they recognized that it was information they really wanted, and they decided to let us go ahead. And so we do try a couple of times. If the community does not participate, then we have to go with the most available current data. And like I mentioned before, some of that data is almost a generation old.
Okay. And then the second part of this is, if, as you said, villagers may be reluctant to talk directly to surveyors from somewhere else and only talk to neighbors who are hired to do the survey, how can you be sure your local surveyors are giving you accurate information and not tailoring it to what the locals want you to know?
Interestingly, it's actually the opposite. In many cases, people would be willing to talk to us, but not to their neighbors. And that happened in the community of Port Allsworth, for example, where ADF&G administered all the surveys at the request of the community.
Okay.
And you know, in my experience, like I said, I've conducted probably hundreds of surveys, and people really want to talk about subsistence. And it's very, very important to them, and they want to give you that information. And in my own view, after doing this so many years, I think they really want to be accurate about what they're saying. And that's why we try to administer these in January, February, or March, immediately after the close of the calendar year, so it's still fresh in people's minds. And I have to mention that the mapping component has added a great dimension, because as you're mapping, people are really starting to remember and think about, you know, where did they go and what were they doing, and I think that's actually increased the validity of our data. Mm-hmm. We're getting much better data for that way.
Okay, great.
Can I respond to that too?
Sure.
And this is a critical question that has come up in the decades that I've been doing interviews too. Probably done as many as David, if not more. But there's a ADF&G paper written by Jim Fall and myself where we do reliability checks. We've set up research designs where you ask the same question in 2 different ways. We've set up Solomon 4 groups for research we did in the Exxon Valdez oil spill. All these are statistical ways of seeing how reliable the data is and how valid it is. And to make a long story short, face-to-face interviews have much higher reliability, much higher validity than anything from permits to mail-ins to whatever. I mean, they are by far the gold standard for reliability and validity. And my experience is exactly like David's. I feel absolutely confident that people are not trying to tell me what I want to hear and or what would make their case look better. I really feel that there's a real honesty, and that's over decades of research.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from the audience, or any more coming in over the web? Quite yet. Yes.
I'm Michael Jesperson. I used to live in one of the so-called rural villages in western Alaska, probably the largest that called itself a village. And at the risk of telling a bunch of PhDs who I didn't have the guts to follow and get your degrees, and at the risk of creating more paralysis by analysis, have you studied how much of subsistence is an idealized format versus reality? when I lived in the so-called bush, I ran a store. And I sold thousands of pounds, even tons of beef, pork, and chicken, not to mention multi-millions of dollars worth of rifles, snow machines, outboard motors, ATVs, fishing nets. To my mind, use of that stuff as subsistence is a little bit off the mark. Subsistence to me is you make your own tools, you go out there and you live on the land, really, not on what came in on the last 4 planes this week and you bought. And I was only one seller of the snow machines, rifles, et cetera, out there. There were many other people that did the same thing, not to mention the ones that imported it. And I loved to go out fishing with my Yupik friends. I learned a whole lot, but at the same time, I was using nets that they'd bought from me the year before. So how much of the subsistence is true subsistence versus modernized subsistence, and does that have an impact on your studies?
I have to answer this. Okay? I have to be one of the answers at least. And it's absolutely a question that came up, especially in my years in the National Park Service, where superintendents had raised the same issue. They said, we don't have any problem with people engaged in consumptive activities within our national parks as long as they do it in a traditional way, i.e. bow and arrow. The answers to that are complex and manifold, but I'll give you 3. One is Alaska Natives, and I'm absolutely sure David will back me on this one, have used the most efficient technology they can get their hands on for thousands of years. That's one. And so the technology is an adjunct only to the basic values of sharing, providing for others, so forth and so on. So that's one answer. The second answer is, and you brought up the issue of being on the land. In this area, if you'll read Non-Dalton, which is a great ethnography by Linda Lana and Andra Paluta, you'll find a discussion where they talk about the deep grief they felt when they were no longer allowed to be on the land to follow the resources because the BIA threatened to take their children away. They were forced into sedentary communities so their children could go to school. And their adaptation to that, i.e. not being able to go to seasonal camps, or was to go to temporary camps and use all kinds of whatever available transportation technology they had to sustain their subsistence lifestyle while still retaining the ability to be with their children. So, and the final answer is, I think the best measures of how deeply held values are not technological or consumptive, but really how people treat each other. And I can absolutely guarantee you that those social network diagrams are a graphic representation of generosity between individuals, families, and households in a community.
Yeah, I would absolutely back up what Don said about the first point. I think tradition is a sliding scale, and that certainly applies to a variety of things, whether it's, whether you see Christianity as tradition or shamanism as tradition over a much longer scale. But it certainly applies to technology. People have always adopted the kind of technology that was more efficient. I think if you could turn the clock back thousands of years, you have people arguing about whether a more advanced kind of stone tool should replace an earlier one, in terms of subsistence harvesting. And it's absolutely the same wherever ideas are coming from, how they're introduced, with contact from whatever people take the most efficient and the most labor-reducing technology in a lot of cases to replace something that was less efficient and required more labor. So it's all part of wild resource harvesting, and so I see that as all part of the same thing. Now store-bought foods, non-wild food resources, another kettle of fish. to a large degree, because those kinds of resources we know are treated in very different ways. They're not shared in the same kind of way, in particular, as we're emphasizing sharing here today, in the same way as wild food resources often are, and that's because they're conceived of as very different ways. They don't contain souls or spirits in the same way, and they're thought of in different ways, and people behave towards them in very different ways. On the other hand, I would say that there's even a caveat there, and that is, for example, if you look at some of the earliest contact in North America, when Champlain brought in dried peas into indigenous peoples of northeast North America, they immediately realized it was a resource they could use to tide them over during the winter that they didn't have immediately available. So even there, with that kind of newly introduced resource, people recognize and incorporate it to the extent they can within their traditional indigenous lifestyle. But I would say, nevertheless, that I would separate those two categories of items of technology versus, store-bought foods, as seeing one as part of a subsistence lifestyle and not necessarily the other. So I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Any other comments? Nope. Okay. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Donnie Flegel with Weedovic, and I'm a mixture of Caucasian and Athabascan and Yupik. And I just want to point out that to the gentleman that was up here asking a question, subsistence isn't an Alaska Native word. And the state of Alaska has had a lot of talks through many administrations trying to define it. The law makes all Alaskan residents subsistence users. And it's really hard when that kind of argument comes up that, yes, we should tear ourselves apart if we're multicultural, and this part should go back to pre-glaciation times and use whatever resources we have, and then this part gets to use the modern civilization's advancements. All civilizations advance. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Alan Asplund. I'm native from the King Salmon, Katmai area. And the thing I have to state is the fact that I see what's happening to our citizens is regulations actually hindering us more than anything based on the fact of the sharing. And what I mean by that, in reference to the park, for the extension of the park, I was able to go there and learn how to fish ice for whitefish underneath the ice. People from Canada came over and taught us how to do this, because then our fishing, commercial fishing, was slumped, almost totally gone. We were going another resource, and that was the closest resource we had then was the whitefish in the Naknek Lake area. I worked at 4 years, got it developed almost into a sailing market, and then by the stroke of the pen of the Secretary of Interior or President, they just extended the park, and there went that subsistence park, because I shared all the fish I caught in that experiment years with the community. And again, in reference to state regulations, what's happening now, before when I went to subsistence, I was able to get like 200 fish and smoke them, and I shared them with the community. Now I get there, and it's a my permit states I'm allowed to get only so much amount of species. There isn't enough for me now to share anymore. So we lost that tradition of sharing. I'm only now to get a household catch, and that you have to put on how many people in your household, this sort of thing. So I think what's missing in your whole package here is regulation, because what's created that is the fact that it's sharing now with the other takers. And that means the sport fishermen, the hunters. We have competition in our subsistence. We never had it before. Prior, as I grew up as a boy, what we did, we had with the federals, we had a game warden there allowed us to go ahead and so we camp meat. We took it and we shared it because we had no refrigeration them days. So we didn't have even ice boxes. Therefore, as we caught, say, a moose, we shared it within the community. There was no waste, this sort of thing. And now, as you see, everything, you've got freezers or what have you. So that is our traditional way of like the lady before me said, subsistence. We didn't call it subsistence. It was just household taking or community needs we shared. It was a sharing way of life. But now I'm hearing all this new methods of doing things and how the research is putting valuations on it. And I guess, are we trying to here basically put a dollar value on the subsistence? And if that's the case with the regulations, pretty soon the more regulations we get, if it's got a dollar value, naturally it's going down. So with that, I thank you.
Okay. I think we're trying to paint a picture of subsistence, and it sounds like regulations are a part of that picture. Now, whether that it needs to be brought out in the baseline studies is, I guess, another question. But the point certainly well taken. So, Steve, you have a comment?
Well, the setup to my comment, Steve Burrell, the setup to my comment that the gentleman just made, my question, or one of them, was have you been able to measure the impact on subsistence of the designation of parks and preserves of Anilka? And that's what he just said. And it's not regulation, but it's statute change by the government, because that was signed by the president. So anyway, I don't know if you've looked at the impact of Anilka, because Anilka was 1980 when it passed, and so 7 years before that or so was when the real shutdown took place, and the effect on the local people would have begun 7 years before 1980.
Go ahead, David.
I think actually Anilka lands usually, there's federal lands, and we don't, as the state, we try not to get into that too much. So I think I wonder if Don would like to take that, since he is experienced with the Park Service.
Yeah, I'm retired.
You're not off the hook.
Yeah. Well, in a quantitative respect, no, because and David, I can't quite remember, but some of the earliest harvest surveys that we cooperated with ADF and G on are the early '80s in Wrangell Single Lives communities affiliated there. So we, I don't know of measures prior to the enforcement and measures after. I will answer your question in another way, and also in some respects respond to the earlier gentleman's comments. One of the reasons we do face-to-face interviews is because people are concerned that the information we're collecting is going to be used against them in terms of enforcement. So one of the things we do in the process, as David clearly showed, was we promise anonymity of the data, that it won't go back to law enforcement and so forth. Speaking again of Jim Magdance, he did a wonderful paper on regulations and its impact on subsistence, and especially if you applied all the regulations to caribou, most subsistence hunters would have a mean of 8 violations per year or something like that. In many cases, off-road communities, people simply ignore the Western management regime. I mean, again, I'm retired, but even when I was with the Park Service, I said, in many cases, you manage a virtual reality, because it's the traditional ecological knowledge and the conservation regime that was indigenous to the community is the one that mostly holds sway. And there's just enormous testimony of young men saying, facing law enforcement officials is nothing. Facing an elder is really serious. And so, how do I put this? Empirically, no, I can't answer your question. My guess is modest impacts, if any. And I've done a lot of C&T analysis, both community and individual. And my guess is people have supplied their needs, especially off-road connected communities.
And I'll just follow up to that. Looking at it from the state side, we do analyze the harvest data as compared to the permit data for hunting, for example, or the permit data for fishing. Because we also want to ensure that, for example, our subsistence harvest permits for the Bristol Bay region, that the numbers we're using to account for the amounts necessary for subsistence are accurate. And so by actually going to the households, like Don said, we feel we get very accurate numbers, and we then compare those to what we're collecting through a permit system and try to evaluate, are we doing an accurate job in the permit system? And when you look at hunting, for example, it's completely different. Of course, people will be lucky if they get a hunting permit or a license, much less turn their ticket back in. And it's really, like Don said, regulated through the cultural notions of what is correct. And I've worked in communities where somebody has chased a caribou down with a four-wheeler. That's unacceptable. The caribou must give itself to you. You do not chase it. And so that person was banished from hunting. The same thing, you throw a moose out in the dump. Well, you've just jeopardized the luck of the entire community by doing that. And so that person was banished from hunting because the moose might know. These type of things are things that really hold sway in the communities, not whether they're going to turn their harvest permit in or not.
Well, but the basic question of the effect of ANILCA and the shutdown of a large part of Alaska has not been addressed in this, is what it sounds.
My 2 cents on that topic are that it illustrates the importance of flexibility and having a whole portfolio of subsistence harvesting areas and resources so that you can adapt to whatever changes there are. And the way an analysis of the effects of ANILCA would have on the proposed Pebble project is to help us analyze how local communities have successfully adapted and compensated in the past, and how rich a portfolio of resources and opportunities, areas, do they need access to have food security and cultural security, in fat times and lean times. And anything, whether it's ANILCA or a mine pit boundary or a pollution event or a climatic event or a change in distribution of animals, any activity that changes the availability of the resource to the community, they're going to have to find some compensating strategy, and they're going to need a portfolio of alternatives if they're going to maintain success and viability.
Just to comment on something Davin said earlier, and he and I talked about it in the hall. He made the comment that when the moose showed up, and I wasn't at all aware of Southwest Alaska not having moose. You said before the 40s, basically.
Yeah, right around the 40s is when they showed up.
They came in. Mm-hmm. Well, I know from Sidney Huntington, his book Shadows of the Koyukuk. It was probably in the 30s that the moose first came into the Koyukuk country, and I've hunted there first time 42 years ago, as I figured out. But so that's an incredible change in the animals. Next, the last thing, Herb, the guy that talked about breathing. What's his last name? Okay. Let me say, for years, many years, mining companies have been coming to explore in Alaska, and they'd come through my office, and I would say to them, I said, now there's something else you need to understand, and that's subsistence, but you'll never understand it. So here's the closest thing to subsistence that you will understand, but realize for the native peoples, it's like with you, if somebody came up behind you and put their arms around your chest and took a hold of their wrist, and you just thought they were going to restrict your breathing, what would you do? You would fight. And that's exactly my description to them for, again, probably 15 years, exactly what Herb basically said. It's so close to breathing for the rest of the Western culture as a comparison. And the other thing is for Todd. Todd, this is my sixth day of being a part of these, and we've seen some great science, and what Steve and his guys have done here are just over the top of all of it. But I describe it as the science is this thick right here. There's that much data, extremely good data that's been brought forward. And now we're talking about a criticism of that much more material and something that could be done a little bit different. But I would have you keep that in perspective, that it's even though the press likes to find the controversy, it's that much of that much data is what they're looking at. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
Could I just make one more?
Yeah, one more really quick one.
Real briefly about moose. Because it illustrates a larger point, we were talking about moose coming in the 1940s here to the Koyukuk a number of decades ago. I actually published a paper back in '89 on a re-examination of moose populations in the western boreal forest, in which I tried to look at this question and establish that it really is a recent phenomenon of the last 100 years or so, and the archaeological work that we're doing right now here out in the Knik area showing there are caribou there until essentially the end of the 1800s, when moose started to come in about a little over 100 years ago. So it's a widespread phenomenon. The question is, where it links to the broader question, is how much is climate, like all of these questions of fisheries and so on, how much is climate change involved, how much is involved with population change, alteration to the vegetation that's a result of Euro-American settlement, all the myriad factors, and they're important to know, and different from caribou, which is a long-term cyclical thing. This seems to be a new kind of thing. Not to say moose haven't been around in some fashion since the end of the Ice Age, but the new kind of development here is something that we need to understand before, in many ways, before we can understand what the impact of any proposed sorts of infrastructure are in any given area. That's why I was talking about analyzing some of these kinds of data in those terms, because in a sense it is part of baseline understanding before we can appreciate what any kind of new proposal might mean in terms of some of these animal populations.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, David. Okay, I think we're going to end the open discussion, and we'll thank Stephen and David and let you guys go. So thank you for your work. And then the next thing I want to do is here, let me give you that so I don't forget it. And where did Steve Colt go? He was wandering around. I want to put him up here. Here he is.